how should we understand the root cause of the famines in Africa? It seems that it has been an ongoing saga for decades, if not hundreds of years.
Thank you, but let me clarify that we are not using the concept of famine yet. There are indicators we use when we determine that
what are you using now?
Or a place is stricken by famine.
Yeah.
Only in South Sudan, we have about 100,000 people affected by famine. The rest of the situation in Africa is called severe food insecurity situation.
Okay, those words are all very important, but what I'm asking is about the root causes of whether you call it famine or severe food problems. Sir, would you like to go directly to the root causes?
Yes, I think the root causes are many and complex, but mainly the biggest one are two, the biggest ones. One is the drought, which is natural.
Yeah.
The other one, particularly in the Lake Chad region and in South Sudan, is conflict. So you see that in countries such as Kenya, a bit of Uganda, and Ethiopia, the biggest problem is drought due to a natural occurrence. The weather was not very good. The short rains failed, and the crops didn't grow very well. But for Somalia and the Lake Chad region, because of the many years of insurgents, farmers cannot access their farming plots. The service providers in agriculture cannot reach them.
Okay.
And so you end up with a complex emergence.
It's always complex, isn't it? But the question is how to resolve this. As you said, famine can be declared only when certain measures of mortality and malnutrition and hunger are met. These are at least 20% of the households in an area, if you take a look at the chart, face extreme food shortages.
Yes.
With a limited ability to cope. Acute malnutrition rates exceed 30%, and the death rate exceeds 2 persons per day per 10,000. Yeah. Of course, this is the tragic situation that we are talking about if it is called famine. And yet, Ms. He, here in Beijing, we could talk about these terminologies for days. We could also sit back and say, well, it have its different reasons. But the question is, where is the solution? Why? Decades, still no solution.
Yes, it's quite sad to see, even after the independence for so many decades, and still, to a great extent, Africans' agricultural productivity still depend on the weather, still depend on whether it has rain on time or not rain, the drought or whatever. So we have to think about those deep the reason and the causes and solutions. One solution, I think, is African countries should improve the agricultural input. This input has been long below those expected target. Many countries, when they make this blueprint for the development, they're saying agricultural input should be reached like 10% of their budget, but very sadly, only few countries they have reached that target. Majority of them still below that, the benchmark.
Right.
So this is one of the solutions. You have to. But many countries, they're saying they're short of budget. So they need many things, education here, there. So there's no money coming from. So that's another issue because many African countries, they're still in that is called a single product, those economic structure.
Right.
They only relies on if they have a raw material, that's oil or like a copper or like cocoa or whatever. So there is no this called multi-structure economic those situation. So that's another way they need to do to modify.
This is interesting because what you are talking about now is a governance issue. Of course, it's really up to their governments to decide what their plans are as to what their people's fate could be. But Mr. Rugalema, since you are working for the UN Agricultural Organization, I'm sure many of the points that Ms. He mentioned here, you have conveyed also to many of your African colleagues in different countries suffering from the food shortage or even famine.
Hello.
Can you
Can
hear
you
me?
come again?
Yes, my point is, what about governance? Is that an important issue? How has that been done in regarding avoiding famine and also food shortage?
Yes, as I said, I think I said at the beginning that part of the cause of these food shortages is conflicts. And conflict results from weak or poor governance. So yes, governance has a role to play, but also the governance of the food systems and the food reserves themselves. If countries could have good food reserves, then they would be able to take care of some of the food shortages that we see around.
What is
But I
preventing
think
them? What is preventing them, Mr. Rugalema, from establishing these what you mentioned, important food conserves, and also is there organizations and experiences they should rely on and also learn from?
Look, it's not that they don't keep strategic grain reserves. Most countries have strategic grain reserves, particularly those countries that are not in conflict. They have stable government and functional states. Like here in Kenya, for example, we haven't imported any food from anywhere because we still have some food in the strategic grain reserve. The problem becomes a big one when the strategic grain reserves are depleted because the drought has lasted for a long time.
Right.
So in the countries where we have conflict, of course, the main issue is to make sure that we negotiate for peace and we attain peace. That is when you can have a functional governance system.
That's true. Ms. He, therefore, before peace is made, we don't want to starve the people to death. So here comes the thing. While peace is being negotiated or still fought for, what about during this process? What each stakeholders could play their role? For example, the governments inside these countries, even though they're experiencing wars in the country, but the governments are still responsible for their people. Secondly, what about regional organizations such as African Union? What role can that play in terms to guarantee a collective safety net of food in Africa? And thirdly, what about the United Nations? How much do you think the international community is still supporting the UN in this regard, helping Africa short and long term? These are all big question mark, isn't it? We can't just wait until peace is here.
Right. There certainly is a joint effort, not only by those countries themselves and also the regional bloc, AU, and even the African, the East, the whole of Africa, they have their own regional bloc. So I think for the case of South Sudan, because South Sudan now, as our African colleagues mentioned, is the worst situation. So the people there suffered from short of food and water, medicine. So because that is the country now suffering from the war, civil war. Ever since 2011, they declare independence. And so they need peace, but the peace negotiation has been pushed forward in a very slow way. And nowadays, even the President Kiir from the South Sudan, he admitted, saying this is a man-made disaster. It's not a natural thing because people are afraid of those war. They flee from their hometown, and then they have no time and energy, safe area to do their agricultural work. So that's the thing. So the peace, how should we make it? We need, first of all, those warring factions like President Kiir, that part, and then the former Vice President Machar. So those two fighting factions, they need to sit down. So their concerns need to be addressed by other those mediators.
I'm sure Mr. Rugalema knows this very well. I want to share with you, Mr. Rugalema, what the World Food Program Director of Emergency, Denise Brown, told the Guardians the other day. The international community, she said, has got to find a way to stepping up to manage this situation until political solutions are found. It seems to coincide with what we have earlier argued. Mr. Rugalema, I'm sure you work very hard with your colleagues in Africa about all of these possibilities. But now the question really is, where can we start? And where should we start? What about this year? What about next year? Can we all forever rely on international assistance about the food shortage situation in Africa? Will the international community still be enthusiastic about that, providing help? As you can see, with the UN, you had already seen the donations from the United States, for example, has been declining dramatically.
Okay, let me build on what my colleague there in
Go
Beijing
ahead, sir.
said. I see the situation in three phases. There is the phase we are in of drought and acute food insecurity, or in the case of Southern Sudan, we are talking of famine. So there we need a resolute effort in humanitarian response. We need to bring water, we need to bring food, we need to bring animal feed, because most of these people who are affected, particularly in the Horn of Africa, are actually dependent on livestock. Livestock is their livelihood, and livestock is the most affected by the drought.
Right.
And that's one. Two is also to prepare for the immediate post-drought phase. When the drought goes and the rain comes back, we need to be ready with the seeds, fertilizer, and other inputs to make sure that we can restart agriculture. I think these two have to go hand in hand. The third one is the long-term one. I have been in the field here in Kenya. I've visited the counties of Marsabit and a few others that are really affected by drought. And what you find is that environmental degradation has been going on for many, many decades. So the drought you see now is a result of many years of degradation. So we will need to invest in resilience of livelihood. We will need to invest in proper destocking. We will need to invest in reforestation and the other such interventions that can make the land regenerate and be productive.